Tonight we do have a special guest, Dr. Rob Gordon, who is a highly regarded clinical psychologist and has worked extensively with communities after natural disasters since Ash Wednesday in 1983. In his presentation this evening, Dr. Gordon will discuss emotions and your many experiences that you combat after emergencies, strategies on managing these feelings throughout your recoveries. Dr. Gordon's kindness, generosity and expertise were recognised with the Medal of the Order of Australia in 2021. It's a pretty prestigious award to receive. I'd like to thank Dr. Gordon for coming and speaking to us tonight and look forward to hearing from you and what you have to tell us today. Congratulations. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for inviting me up here. I get to see a whole lot of places in Australia that I would never normally go to, not for very good reasons, of course. I started with this work, as you've just heard, in Ash Wednesday, when I was part of a children's hospital team that was sent up to the Macedon area. I was part of the rural catchment area of the children's hospital. And before we went up there, I did a bit of reading and so on, and I realised actually no one really knows what we should be doing after disasters. And so I went up there really to sort of ask the question, what's going on for people after disasters and what do they need? In something like a bushfire, you have quite a lot of trauma on the day. Trauma is really about a very threatening, dangerous experience that happens, probably quite quickly. Is this still working? Yep. And that trauma is what often kickstarts a reaction. With a flood, as I understand yours was, floods can be very traumatic too. I worked in the Lockyer Valley and if you go down to Rochester, there's some, pretty dramatic stories there too. But in a slow, kind of seeping flood that comes across, such as I understand yours was, it's different. It's not better or worse, it's different. And actually every disaster has its own character. Every flood in every community has its own character, the way it comes, how it affects the particular communities. And so it's very hard to generalise, except that alongside the unique characteristics for each community, there are certain fundamentals that come up again and again and have to do with the fact that people's lives are disrupted and thrown out of their kilter, that they have a whole range of different losses, and that they start a long process of recovery. Now, I could ask you, before the flood came, how many of you had large amounts of spare time that you didn't have any idea what to do with, and you were bored and you wanted a new interest in life? See, the thing is that you've got now two jobs. You've got to run your farm and you've got to repair it at the same time, don't you? Fix it up, recoup the losses. And actually your lives were already full up, weren't they? They're already full up to the seams with activities. And now, what are you going to do to cram all of this new activity in? Because what I noticed was, although you have some people who have acute trauma, and we really need the real clinical skills to work with that early on, some people have really serious anxiety disorders in the immediate aftermath because they just can't see how they're going to get through it. Or they go into a depression, and these are our familiar mental disorders. But as I went through, and I was in that community for 4 years, sort of reducing frequency, of course, and people would come later in the sequence, and they would talk about what had been happening. And what I started to realise is that actually a lot of the problems that occur are not about the physical event of the disaster. They're about the effect that has on people's lives as it unfolds. And that can be helped or made worse by the way the systems actually get in there and manage it. I'll give you an example. There was a terrible flood that I read about before I went up to Macedon, in a place called Buffalo Creek in the US, one of those little coal mining Appalachian Mountains places. They had tailing dams, and they had a huge flood that swept them all away and came in the middle of the night, and a lot of people died and houses were destroyed. But what the American government did was they decided to set up what they call trailer parks, very large trailer parks, caravan parks we'd call them, for accommodation. And they simply gave people caravans on a first-come, first-served basis without any regard to where they came from. So what they did was they completely dismantled the social system that people had in these small communities where they lived very closely together, mountainous area, just a little valley, a little group of people, and they lost all of their friends and networks and all of the mutual aid networks. And that was a typical example of how, instead of gathering up the remnants of the community so that they could continue to have at least some continuity, they were disbanded. So now people will often say, and I started to read this when I started to read examples of disasters, that the physical event was all very well. We can understand that terrible things happen, nature's unpredictable. But what we really feel bitter, it was what they called the second disaster, which is what happens during the recovery period. And I started to realise that often it's what happens in the years of recovery that has the very lasting effects. Now, by that I mean if you like, the physical effects are reversible eventually. They cost a lot of money, and people might end up never being quite in as good a position as you were in, and so on. But eventually that'll get sorted. But if during these years you don't take care of yourself and you end up coming out of the other end with a serious illness that changes your whole quality of life, that's an irreversible loss, isn't it? Or if in the course of it the relationship breaks down and you end up separating, that's an irreversible loss. I tell the story of the man who came to see me 5 years after Ash Wednesday. I'd seen him and his wife and 2 kids early on. And he actually, this is a bushfire, it's a bit different, but the principles are still there. He decided all he could do was rebuild his house. He'd built it himself out of mud bricks. And his neighbour came across and said, I've lost my house too, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to rebuild. And so the neighbour said, well, I'll help you. So these 2 men spent the next 6 months, every minute they weren't earning their living, up on his block rebuilding his house. 6 months he got it to lock up, and they move in. And his neighbour comes across and says, fantastic, I'm so pleased you're in, I'm going to start mine now. So he felt so deeply obliged to this man that he felt obliged now to give the next 6 months to his neighbour. 2 years later, that's 3 years after the fire, he and his wife have divorced, they've sold everything, and he's living in a flat near the Essendon airport, seeing his kids every second weekend. And when he comes to me, he says, I don't understand what happened. I thought I had a good marriage. Now, this is a dramatic example, but it's the example I talk about because that's an irreversible loss, isn't it? But it was an unnecessary loss. Well, you know, marriages do break down, but what he didn't understand was he thought the physical recovery was the priority. I've got to get my family in a house. But taking care of his marriage and his children and his family life was the most important thing, because that can't be redone. The house can be done eventually. But the whole system, we've just heard the deadline of the 30th of April. You've got to get your applications in or you lose $75,000. That's a bit alarming, isn't it? I'll talk about why deadlines are difficult. You know, whenever I get the chance, I try and say, let's soften the deadlines, let's give it more time, but they don't listen to people like me down there. But you see, the foundation of our life is our relationships, and it's the routines of life that we develop to give expression to what's important in life. I spent some time up at Coonabarabran and areas around there. They had a whole series of fires some years ago. And there was a wonderful woman there. She wasn't a recovery woman. She wasn't like Josie here. She worked for the equivalent of DELP. But she was one of those women, and I'm sure you've got them here, and men, who hold the whole community in their heart. They know everybody. They've lived there all their life. They've got a file in here on everybody. And she came up to me and said, I've been working on this couple. I'm really worried that their marriage is in trouble. Because you know that in the country, don't you? I'm really worried, and I've been working on them to get them to come to you. And these are the issues that I think are important, blah, blah, blah. And so I give my talk, and we do a few other things. And then I come back about 3 years later to another fire in a neighbouring area, and she comes along and says, I must tell you, after you came up, this couple whose marriage was in trouble, they completely changed their life. Instead of working 7 days a week, now it's a big flat area probably like this up there, and she said what they do is they take Sunday off. Now, I won't ask you to put your hands up, but how many of you take Sunday off? You probably say, we haven't got the luxury of that. Don't you realise we've had a flood? We've got a whole lot of work to do? I'll come to that in a minute. But they now take Sunday off. They went out and bought a couple of bicycles, and they cycle about 10 kilometres from their property into the little town, which has got one of those beautiful new age cafes with lots of organic food and good coffee and all that sort of stuff. And they go in there and they have this great big breakfast, and they sit in the sun, you know, that soft New South Wales sun, and they drink coffee and read the local papers and so on, and sit around there for a while, and then when they're ready, they quietly ride their bikes back home and they take the rest of the day off. And she said they are different people. Now, what I learnt from this is that a lot of the important mental health concerns are as a result of the stress effects on normal people who are not suffering from mental disorders any more than the usual mental disorders we all suffer from, right? Normal people. And so normal people are usually in a position to use information, make decisions and take care of themselves, which is why they haven't got mental disorders beforehand. They're looking after themselves. But what I want to emphasise now is just a couple of points on what stress does to us. After dinner, I'll talk a bit about strategies, but I want to just talk about why stress undermines our capacity to function, to meet deadlines, fill out forms. Did you ever have trouble filling out forms? Did you ever have where you thought, I really should ring up the bank or Telstra or one of those, and I just can't do it today? I just can't sit on the end of the phone for 2.5 hours trying to explain my story 3 times, or is that just me? You just can't do it today. Now, what I've observed is we've got 2 different stress responses. We've got the acute stress. Acute stress is triggered when we confront a situation where we've got a massive problem, we must do something straight away, otherwise it's going to get a lot worse now. And the example would be when you nearly tread on a snake. You don't actually make any decisions, something happens. You just react, don't you? Do you have snakes up here? Yeah. You guys probably just pick them up and flick them out to the side. No. That, and the chemical that helps us to do that is adrenaline. We have adrenaline when you have a near miss in the car and you go, and then you think, my God, what happened? And sometime later you start having the heebie-jeebies thinking, oh my God, because at the time you're not processing anything, you're just responding to the environment. And that'll be not quite so dramatically, but that's what's going to be happening when the flood is happening. And you're rushing around trying to move stock and work out what to do and make decisions and do things. And adrenaline has this capacity to override the feedback systems. So you don't feel tired or hungry or sad or anything. You've just got a lot of stuff to do. And what happens when someone comes up to you and says, you're looking tired, have you had a break? You say politely, excuse me, would you mind going away? I've got a lot of work to do. Only you say it very loudly with very short words, don't you? What's that? That's what we do down here, down in town anyway. Because they're actually asking you to look at yourself, but you've completely put that off the agenda because you're focused, all your energy out there. And what adrenaline does is it mobilises all the reserves of energy that we've got stored up in our body. We've got a whole lot of sugars and things, and these chemicals flood our system, and so we can do heroic things. But it does cost us. If you stay on adrenaline long enough, have you ever seen this happen? People go and go and go, and then they suddenly collapse, and they can't recover for a long time because it's as though they've completely exhausted themselves. When I think of an analogy, I think of the old Volkswagens from my youth. That's going back to the 60s. And they didn't have any of this fuel-injected computerised stuff. What happened when you ran one of those motors to the end? You couldn't just put petrol in, could you? You had to open the carburettor and you had to splash petrol in and poke it down those little tubes to get the whole thing moving. And when we get adrenaline exhaustion, our carburettors are dry. And when you rest, you don't necessarily feel better because you've really drained yourself. So that's the first thing. And therefore, I think it's very important around about now, because people come out of adrenaline when they actually realise, I've done all the most dramatic, urgent things. And now, oh my God, look what I've got here. I've got this huge task. How long is that going to take? And our brains change gear from acute stress to continuing stress. How do I manage a very long-term stress demand? And if we say that the adrenaline state puts us into emergency mode, survival mode, if you like, the state we go into when we've got a continuing stress is, I call it endurance mode, because that's created by a situation where we see I've got a huge problem, but there's nothing I can do to fix it today or tomorrow or the next day. I just have to keep going for a long, long time. And this is the situation we're in, where we suddenly got 2 lives full of activity, the ordinary life and suddenly the recovery life. And then it becomes very important to make strategic decisions. So this man that I give the example of in Macedon, he really had a very important strategic decision. What's the most important thing here? Number 1 is marriage and family. Number 2 is house. So I'll put that first. That means instead of working on Sundays, where I get a hell of a lot of work done with me mate on the block, I'm going to stay with the family and give them time. You know, he's got to override what the simple physical equation is. But when you get into that continuing stress state, it's very adaptive because, you know, I call it the zombie mode. I get into it too, where you can just go, you know, just go and go and go and go and go. Now, in that state, what I've observed is we can do anything that is familiar, automatic and routine, right? So a farmer, I've heard farmers say, you know, and their wives say, look, we should sit down and make a budget and work out about making these applications. They said, I can't think about that. And they go out and build a few kilometres of fencing, which they can probably do in their sleep. But the whole business of taking on all of these new, you know, juggling of figures, and it's just too hard. And this is because when we go into that endurance mode, we have to conserve and focus our attention. And so we're going to focus that on the thing that to us is most important. Now, that may or may not be actually from the big picture the most strategically important thing, but it's going to be the thing that I think is most important. And isn't it the case when you've got so much to do, sometimes you'll fix on something you can do, and that'll make you feel better, even though it's not the most important thing? Like the example I get, you know, I'm an expert in stress because you ask my wife, I live stressed all the time because I'm running around the countryside, seeing too many people and so on. So some days I've got a couple of hours in the afternoon. Oh my God, think of that. I can do some of the things. And I've got to write a complicated court report for some troublesome lawyers or something, and they've been complaining that I haven't written it. And that means I've got to take lots of information, I've got to put it all together and analyse it and work out. But I just can't do it this afternoon. I'm too, you know, what I can do is I can rush around and tidy things up, make a few phone calls, do a lot of filing, which I won't remember where I've put it because I can't remember the logic I had as to why I put it in those files. Have you ever done that? You know, have you ever put things on your computer where you can't find it? Well, what was I thinking? And you eventually find it. Now you've got these searches, you know. Oh my God, why would I put it in that folder? You see, it's a lack of strategic planning, thinking, and putting the time in. And so there are things we cannot do in that state. And I could go into all the neuroscience, which we know now, because in the adrenaline, you're actually in your reptile brain. That's why you can react so quickly. There's not much language in those parts of the brain, which is why you have a lot of trouble filling out forms when you're in that adrenaline state. When you're in this other state, the endurance mode, you've got a different chemical. It's complicated, but let's just call it cortisol. Cortisol's about endurance and husbanding and conserving and repairing and growing and all that part, whereas adrenaline's all about using the energy, you know, do things, run around. So you focus in and you start to just plod away in that zombie mode. And when things come into that narrow things, you can address them. And when people come up and start telling you things that don't fit into you, you can say, go away, you're overloading me. And now this is wonderful for, say, building the fences. But I have had farmers tell me, one particular farmer who, you know, I went several times to this community in New Zealand, actually. They were dairy farmers, very, very badly flooded. And I gave, you know, a number of talks over this 2-year period. At the end of the 2 years, he said, came up to me afterwards and he said, you know, now that I've sort of come to understand this business about stress, when I look back, I realised that most of the work I did in the first few months, working from dawn till dusk, exhausting myself and all my family, has had to be completely redone later because it wasn't thought out. It wasn't planned. So I think the sort of thing he did was just put up his fences again, only to realise in New Zealand all the topsoil gets stripped off the top and there's gravel underneath, so you get these gravel beds which will take quite some years to grow grass again. So what he probably had to do was to actually reconceptualise, how am I going to get some paddocks and rotation going here? And that would mean he'd have to step right back and take some time to think, so that he used his time. Now, I don't want to say that it's anything like that here, but I think the principle is that often the decisions we will make early on, we will actually come later to think that's not the best decisions we would make. And so there are several, what we know about the neuroscience is that it's not, with cortisol, it's not the reptile brain which gives us those quick reactions and all that strength and courage and whatever. It's this dogged plodding away at basically what are generally familiar tasks at the expense of creative thinking, lateral thinking, problem solving, finding new ways, taking in new information, making plans, long-term plans, thinking about priorities. To prioritise, you've got to hold a whole lot of things in your mind, don't you? Hold them all in your mind and then sort of work out what's really important here and juggle them around. So, this is really, that's that, and then this one, and so on. You've got to do it. But in this state, we can't hold enough in our mind. We're on this sort of narrow gauge railway, which we can just do what we're doing. And this is really where I think if we're not careful, we don't understand that and get deeper and deeper into that state, we work harder and harder but less and less efficiently. At the same time, we are draining our bodies. Now, there's no clock around here. That's dangerous when I start talking. You'll make a sign. Yes. What I've done is I've been reading around what's going on, where do we get this energy from? And I think it's important to understand because around about now, if my guesses are correct, everyone's starting to feel very tired. There's a particular sort of quality of fatigue where you don't really bounce back after a quiet weekend and a lot of sleep. On Monday morning, you're still feeling pretty tired. Now, I noticed this already in Macedon, but it's been a pattern which when people, something's happened and the workers sort of ask me to sort of talk to them about what to expect, and I say you'll get a big sort of surge of people showing distress and need for support early on because it's terribly sudden and disturbing. And then it'll often die away, and this has been observed again and again, die away. And then there'll be another surge around about 6 months for all sorts of services. Maybe mental health, maybe physical health, maybe people start having accidents. I can remember at Macedon we used to meet in the rooms of the GP, and all the people working in the health and welfare networks would all get together on a Friday morning and talk about the community. And I can remember, a couple of months down the track, we went round the room and everyone just talked about what was happening, and most people went round and said, things are pretty quiet now, we haven't had too much and we're starting to settle down. I remember the GP saying, I reckon we're just about over it. And I thought to myself, I don't know nothing much about disasters, but that doesn't sound right to me. And the next week we came back and he said, I don't know what's happened, the community's gone mad. People are having chainsaw accidents, they're having emotional stoushes in their marriage, they're coming down with illnesses, they're having car accidents. And everyone was saying everyone was really busy. And what I sort of noticed is you get this cyclical process. And often with this sort of stress focus, you have this short-term focus. I think we're over it. And then, of course, when you suddenly find you or others are feeling awful, you feel absolutely demoralised. But I think it's so important to understand this cycle, because I think when I try to understand this, so I say 6 months, but it could be between 4 and 8 months, I think that's about the time that a normal, reasonably healthy person can function in overdrive before they start to come to the end of their energy and the end of their exhaustion. But the thing is that cortisol, like adrenaline, is a stress chemical because it shuts down the feedback system. We don't ask how tired we are, we ask, what do I have to do today? You know, you wake up in the morning, you feel exhausted, but then you think about what you can do and you get yourself going and off you go. And now, where does the energy come from? Well, what I've learned is that those stress chemicals have changed the way our body creates and uses energy. Normally we create energy molecules and they go into all the cells of our body, and the big molecules go into the cells because the cell wall's clever, it lets in the big ones, but it doesn't let them out again. And then in the cells, these molecules are broken down, and in the breaking of the bits of the molecule, they release energy, which allows the cell to make proteins and do all the things that, don't ask me, but, you know, do its stuff. That's where the energy comes from. And out go the little waste products, right? Big molecules in, waste products out, fragments. Now, but when we've got a tremendous need for energy, we don't know how long it's going to go for, and we've got all these chemicals, they change the way the cell walls work and suck the large molecules out of the tissues where they're not immediately needed, and they are redistributed to where they're really needed, which is going to be brain and brawn. That's it. So do you notice how bits of your body deteriorate when you're under stress? You know, your hair goes brittle and grey and drops out, and your fingernails get all wrinkled, and, you know, and your skin breaks down and your digestion doesn't work so well. You get constipated, you get halitosis, and you can become generally unattractive when you're in stress for a long time. Have you ever seen those pictures? Sometimes people, back before the pandemic, used to give me, magazines about film stars to put in my waiting room, and I used to flick through them sometimes when I was having my lunch. And they have these pictures of some extremely beautiful, glamorous film star on a bad day when she's at the supermarket and she looks terrible. And you can see how stressed her life is when she doesn't have all this stuff, you know, unattractive. And that's showing that our bodies are lacking that energy that gives us the life and the vibration. And the most common medical complaint, or health complaint generally after disasters, is a whole range of what are called psychosomatic complaints. Psychologically induced physical complaints, digestive disorders, skin problems. If you've got something like asthma, that'll be worse. You get anything, tinea, constipation, I've been through them all. You know, there's usually two big columns of all these little things. Now, that's the sign that those tissues are being depleted of the energy they need to keep them going. And that energy's been siphoned off and used in the things that are in the narrow focus of your stress. Now, that's like building a huge overdraft, isn't it? Because there's going to be a point where those cells start screaming for energy to make up what they've lost. And that's the message. Where we're deficient of energy, that's the feeling of fatigue, right? But it's an overall feeling of fatigue. And it'll actually impair our ability to do the mental work. And that's when something that's not too familiar, like filling out a form, it's too hard. I can't cope with it. I can't cope with it. Why? Because actually maybe a lot of people have never had to ask for help before, and that evokes feelings. Do I deserve this? I'll tell you, there's a couple of things that I think are important to bear in mind. Again, looking at the big picture of what disaster services are about. The narrow picture is, I've never asked for help before. Look, we weren't so badly affected off. You should go and see Rob Gordon. He's a basket case. He needs all the help he can get. And you come up and see me, and I'll say, look, I'm fine, but Mal, you should go down and see him. He's a basket case. That's what they'll be saying to the Red Cross outreach workers. And because, in fact, most of us in our self-respect try to say, can I get up and get out of bed in the morning? Yes, I can. I should go to work. And we've done that for years. If I can get functioning, I'll do it. And in that case, we're not actually seeing the big picture. This is not charity, the $75,000. It's an entitlement. The government, in their wisdom, have set some criteria as to who is eligible for this. And if somebody, and this comes up in every disaster, if somebody says, come to me and say, look, Rob, would you like to fill out this form? Oh, look, I can't really think about that, and I don't need charity. I'll be all right. Give it to poor old Mal. He's in trouble. And now the thing is that if I give up that $75,000, the government is not going to say, Rob Gordon hasn't used his. We'll give 15 cents to all the other applicants. Right? That doesn't make sense, does it? If you meet the criteria, you get the money. If you don't meet the criteria, you don't get the money. It's as simple as that. And if somebody doesn't use it, they're not going to give twice as much to somebody else because it's going to go back into consolidated revenue or somewhere. Can you see? Now, where does that money come from? You. The only way the government gets money is through taxes. So the big picture is you have paid this as a self-respecting, hard-working person. You've paid all this money in taxes for many years, and the government has kept taking a bit of it off and putting it in a bag saying if there's a disaster, we'll give some of it back to them. Right? So it's your money, isn't it? Just as if you'd put it in the bank, except the government wouldn't allow that and they'd tax you. Interest, or we don't have interest anymore, but do you see what I mean? So the big picture is I've got to put it outside my normal self-respect, which values my autonomy and my independence. And the real message I have is that during this period when you're overworking for a long time, now there's no way you can avoid overworking, but we've got to be clever. We've got to hang on to what's important that we can't replace. And so during this period, we've got to make good decisions about how we last the distance. And I'm going to talk about that after the meal. And I just want to finish off with this one word. This particular quality of exhaustion we start to feel around about now, which can interfere with people's ability to make decisions and carry out the best recovery. I call it cellular fatigue, to give it a name, because it's a different thing than the normal fatigue we have for doing a busy day's work, which you bounce back, you have a rest, have a quiet weekend. The cellular fatigue's much deeper, and it takes longer to replenish it. And I think we've got to keep an eye on that, because that's where the emotional problems will come from, because if we don't have enough energy, it's very difficult to manage emotion, number one. And number two, if we don't have enough energy and we keep pushing ourselves, it's okay for young blokes like you, but old people like me put our health at risk, right? There's a lot of evidence that there are a range of health problems that come a year or more after the end of an extended period of stress. So it's not while you're in it, and it's not straight afterwards. It's a year or more later that you come down with some things that will change your quality of life. And I think around about now, it's a good time to be here. This is the time to actually stop and say, hang on a second, how long is this going to take? I need to make a plan about getting through that. And that's what I'll talk about after the meal. Thank you.
Okay, the meal's going to be served in about 10 minutes' time, so that gives you a chance for a toilet break or to bother Neil for another drink, and then see you back at your table ready for dinner to be served. Flood Recovery Newsletter, we put that out, that's today's edition 10 on the 3rd of March. All previous copies are available on the Loddon Shire Council website. You can subscribe to that newsletter and we will email it to you. And I'd also like to acknowledge the National Centre for Farmer Health, which has some brilliant resources on its website, so I encourage you to have a look at that. But they've provided some funding tonight to cover the recording of Rob's presentation, and it will be available on their website for you to pass on to anybody else who'd like to hear what Rob had to say after the event.
Hard copies of that available at Boort Agency?
Yes. Good plug.
Thanks. So we've talked about these two different stress reactions and how stress it helps us to deal with problems by allowing us to forget ourselves and focus on the problem. And if you want to summarise it, you can say stress reduces self-awareness, right? You become less aware of yourself. And, if you think of a simple thing of stressing your muscles, I can remember as a kid, it was my job to look after the chooks. And I don't know why the chook house was built so far away from the tap. I had this, I had this bucket of water I used to have to carry. And, it seemed such a long time, and I didn't want to stop and sort of shake my hand every now and again and pick the bucket up. So I used to try and do it in one shot because I wanted to get back and watch television or do something useless like that. And when I actually made it all the way, first of all, you start to get tired, then it starts to hurt, and then it goes numb, doesn't it? It goes numb if you hold something long enough. And the only problem is when you come to put it down, actually you've got a spasm, you have trouble letting it go, and then it's very painful to let it go. And I think that happens when we're in that stress mode. It becomes painful to relax. You ever be really busy and you finished your dinner, as you guys are now, but you can't go anywhere. You have to be polite and just sit here and listen to me. But normally you have a lot of trouble when you've got so much to do, just relaxing, don't you? You start bustling around and doing a whole lot of useless stuff because you can't stop. It's painful to stop. And so the important thing is to re-engage that sense of self, because most of us have got this far in our lives because we've learned to look after ourselves. But looking after yourselves depends on knowing how you feel and what you want, what you need. And so one of the key problems is re-engaging with yourself. Now, I've got a sort of simple recipe for dealing with stress. It's very simple. It's pleasure and leisure. And you'll be saying, we haven't got time for that sort of nonsense. Don't you realise we've had a flood and we've got all this work to do? Let's just think about it. Pleasure, enjoyment, satisfaction, and all of the experiences that yield a sense of joy and achievement and fulfilment, they feel good because our body and mind are releasing tensions and going into an optimal state. An optimal state. It means when you're enjoying yourself, you're taking in more energy than you're giving out. That's why it feels nice, right? even if it's something simple like, I don't know, the satisfaction of completing a knitting project, or of weeding a garden bed or something. Just something that you can say, I enjoyed that. Or, you know, like this couple I spoke about, riding their bikes in and having a nice breakfast and then going home and having a snooze or something. That enjoyment is our sign that we are storing energy. That means we're starting to go beyond just the ordinary operating tank. That's right, I was going to say about the Volkswagens. You know, the Volkswagens back in those days used to have a spare petrol tank. Does anyone remember those spare petrol tanks? Now, I seem to remember that there were two ways of opening it. One seemed to be I vaguely remember some kind of screw thing between the seats, and I also remember a lever under the dashboard. And I remember driving out in the country once and the car spluttered, and I looked and I said, oh my God, we're on empty. He said, don't worry, we've got a spare petrol tank. And he reaches under the dashboard and flicks the lever, and the car, you know, comes to life again. Then he turns to me and says, I've no idea how much petrol's in the spare tank though. Because there's no gauge on the spare tank. Now, there's no gauge on our spare tank. There's no gauge to tell us how much cellular fatigue we've got, how much energy we've soaked out of the unnecessary tissues. So we don't know how to look after ourselves there. What we do know is that we can't function clearly, because you need a fund of spare energy to tackle a problem like fill out one of those bloody forms. You've got to be able to sort of draw, you know, dig in and draw, oh, I better do this. And one of the signs that your cellular fatigue is high is that I just haven't got it in me today to do all sorts of things. And this fund of store of energy is only going to be built up by pleasure and leisure. Pleasure is very important. Enjoyment, satisfaction, achievement, fulfilment. And of course, the aftermath of disaster is filled with frustrations, and I can't get things done, and I haven't got as much done as I wanted, and all these frustrations build up. So it becomes very important to be able to be a bit strategic and think, to actually make a list and be able to tick a few things off and say, I've actually got something done. And this means you've got to override the difficulty you have thinking and planning. I went up and gave a talk in Lockyer Valley after the floods there. The Red Cross organised it. I went up there and I gave this talk, and I got to know the Red Cross person who was organising, and I came back. And I remember she rang me up one day, and I was out in the garden, and I answered, and she said, it's Mary here from Red Cross in Queensland. Oh, how are you, Mary? She said, I'm good, but I don't know if I should give you some feedback about your talk. I said, yeah, sure, it's really important. Well, I've had this farmer who said he came along, he was really looking for something, and he didn't get anything from it. And I thought, oh, that's terrible. Now, I sort of feel a bit obliged to provide after-sales service for my talk. So I said, well, look, give me his phone number and I'll give him a call. So I rang him up. Now, this man, he described this cortisol state. He was very demoralised, and he'd lost interest in his farm. He loved his farm. It's the only thing he'd ever wanted to do. But he didn't want his family to come out. They lived in town, and he didn't want them to come out and help him. Just leave me alone. Go away and leave me alone. He was a bit depressed. And he described how he'd get up in the morning and he'd have trouble getting out of bed, and then he'd think, I've really got to get my tractor going and do this particular job, plough his field or something. And he'd go out there and he'd start tinkering with his tractor and setting it up. And then he realised he'd need a spanner, and he'd go across to the shed to get a spanner. And there he'd see on the bench the water pump that he was halfway through repairing, which he'd forgotten about. And then he gets sidetracked onto the water pump. And as he was fiddling with the water pump, he realised he needed something from another shed, and he'd go over there and there was something else there, right? Why are you all laughing? I do that on my desk. I do that when I'm going to file an email, and as I'm looking down for it, I come across 3 other emails I should have already done. And when I deal with that, I think I can't remember what I was going to do before. This is cortisol mind. And so he said, by the end of the day, I'd be staggering back to my house to have dinner, and I'd pass the tractor. I think, oh my God, that's right, I was going to do the tractor. Now, see, the cortisol state of mind, you lose this capacity to hold it all together and organise it, which is what we need in order to achieve, to have a feeling of getting somewhere, of doing something, of taking another step towards recovery. And so I think the more we can disengage. It's like my arm as a kid won't go into spasm if I just put the bucket down and give it a bit of a shake and then pick it up again. That's all you need. You just need to disengage. And it's about quality, not quantity. If I let my being come out of this cramped up state just for a few moments, I'll re-engage with myself, and then I can sort of buckle down and have another busy week. And all we realised was this man, he didn't understand why he was so despairing, and he'd lost interest in his farm. It took us 3 conversations to track it down. Eventually he realised that what had happened was his neighbour, he was going away for the weekend, going into his family in town, and his neighbour said, look, before you go, do you mind if I build a bit of a levee around my house? He said, no, go for your life. When he came back on Monday, he found this guy had got all his mates together with their earth-moving equipment and built a levee bank across the entire length of his property. There was a creek between them on the other side of the creek, which now meant he would get all the flood water. And he'd kind of tried to get some action on this. He gave me a long description of all the people he'd approached for this illegal levy, and he couldn't get anyone to do anything. And he sort of lapsed into this feeling of despondency and despair. But he lost track. It took us 3 conversations for him to realise that's actually when things changed. And really, once he realised that, he was able to start to think a little bit more positively, not try and change it because that didn't seem to be possible. But he thought, well, you know, we don't know when we'll have the next flood, so I'll just get on with things in the meantime. And then he started to close the loop and achieve things. Now, I think that shows that there's something very important about being able to speak about your situation, because when you have to speak about something, you have this great bundle of dark cloud feelings, and someone is interested and asks you some questions to get you going, and you have to actually look at yourself and find words and so on. You have to impose some order on it all. And usually that gradually helps us to get a bit of an understanding. And that understanding then allows us to find a different way of thinking about it and maybe feel a bit more optimistic and just move things along. And the next time I rang him back, he said, look, I'm actually feeling a lot better. I think I'll be all right. I don't think I need to talk again because and he reeled off a whole lot of jobs he'd started doing on the farm. And once he was going, his sense of satisfaction of what he was achieving became a self-motivating process. But he had been in, that's what he was hoping to get something from the talk, but he didn't get it from the talk. We had to have a few conversations. And so instead of getting satisfaction from starting to achieve things in the flood recovery, he was getting a sense of increasing failure and driving himself mad. Don't we drive ourselves mad in this state? You know, you go up to the bedroom thinking, I'm going up to the bedroom, and you get to the bedroom and think, what did I come here for? Why is that happened? Because on the way up to the bedroom you think of all the things you really need to do, And by the time you get there, you've started to try and deal with things that you can't deal with because you've got to... And then you think, I can't remember why I went. Then you go back and I realise, I need to get my glasses because I can't read the computer screen. And then you go back to the bedroom and you can't find your glasses. But as you pass the mirror, you see you've got them on your head. These sort of things drive us mad, and we actually frustrate ourselves. So these are signs. They are absolutely typical signs of this cortisol state. In fact, there was a group after Black Saturday, a support group that was, we were able to get some support groups where people who were struggling with their recovery could just get together in these groups and each month and just talk together. And one of my colleagues was running one of these groups, and she told me that this bloke used to come in, a big tall bloke, and he'd come in and he'd say to everybody, I've had a shocking month. I've been in the corduroy zone all month. And she didn't understand what this was about. But they all knew, and they said, the corduroy zone, isn't it shocking? It's terrible. The only thing you can do is try and get out of the corduroy. And she eventually realised as they talked to her, there was his sort of garbled interpretation of what I'd been talking about in the communities as the cortisol state. But it's a wonderful term, isn't it? You're in the corduroy zone and you can't get anything done. And so your first priority is to know, I'm in the corduroy zone, I've got to get out of it. So the first way of getting out of it is to do something enjoyable, because that will give you energy, a sort of energy that you can't get any other way. So leisure. Leisure is, my definition of leisure is you don't have to do anything. What do you mean you don't have to do anything? Don't you realise there's been a flood and I've got all this work to do? No, you can actually be like this couple in Coonabarabran and say, we're not going to work on Sundays, or Sunday afternoon, or, you can actually carve out a bit of time and say, I'm not going to work in this time. It's hard, but you will receive benefit, because leisure means you've got nothing to do but to tune into what you want to do. Not what you have to do, but what you want to do. And it's painful. You feel restless and irritable. And what you want to do is do that regularly, so you don't get into that position that people get into when they work and work and work, and they've booked this lovely holiday in Bali, and they work and work and they try and get everything organised, get everything sorted out before they go, so they can go with an absolutely clear mind. And when they get on the plane, they have a ripping migraine that lasts for about 3 days. Or they come down, as soon as they arrive in Bali, they get the flu for the first week, which is showing that they've changed pace too quickly. So if you wait until you're exhausted, that change of pace is a real collision for your body and mind. So what you can do is you can break that up and take little doses of leisure and some enjoyment to go with it, so that you keep getting out of it. And that means you retain your body and mind, keep in touch with the whole range of different sorts of experience you have. And if you do that, you don't cramp up into this zombie mode. When you get into zombie mode, and there's been research done on this, not from farmers that I know of, but other experiments where they've done it, and they find if you put people under a high amount of pressure, where they've got complicated problems to solve, and you keep ramping the pressure up, you'll find there's a certain point where they actually can't keep up with the complexity of the problems they're having to deal with, and they start to lapse back to use strategies that they have employed at an earlier stage of the experiment that were shown to be unsuccessful. So people fall back on what they know how to do, even if they know it's not going to work, because we've got to do something, so we're going to do what I've trained to do. And I think this happens in all sorts of situations. It's the inability to think creatively. Now, we know that it's so often the case that if you take time out, take leisure, then the next day you will often be able to solve problems. Isn't that right? You often see things differently. You get a bit of a perspective, get another angle. You can think of things you didn't think of before. Or you can look at things that yesterday you just felt you couldn't face, but now you can. And it's having been able to let go of it. I think that's such an important thing. I think we have a problem when our mind stays locked on to problems. You know, wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning thinking about all the things you have to do. It's not a good time because you can't make the phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning, can you? So if you're rehearsing the phone call, that's just pure worry. Now, my definition of worry is trying to solve a problem at the wrong time. Right? Worrying. You keep going around it. And so it becomes very important to notice when you're doing that and just say, no, I don't need to deal with that now. I will deal with it later. If you're worried about your memory, write it down. It's not, in this state, it's not really memory problems. It's the organisation of memory. When I go up to get my glasses, I haven't forgotten that I'm going to my bedroom to get something. I've just forgotten what I'm going to get, right? And I will find it. So it's not a memory problem, it's the organisation of your memory. I know I've filed something on my computer, I just don't know where it is. So this leisure is like opening a space in this pressurised world where you can just relax with your mind and your attitudes. Now, this really touches on something that becomes very important further down the track when the recovery's finished. Because when the recovery's finished, well, it's never really finished, but when you're sort of back into a normal routine, there's another stage that comes, which is, it's probably more clear-cut if you've had your house burnt down in a bushfire. But I'm sure the same principle will apply in a flood. And that is, when people move into their new house, they have a big moment of relaxation, and then they start to remember all the things they lost in the fire that they haven't had to think about while they're living in temporary accommodation. All the things that have history or carry some sense of identity, heirlooms and things they've stored and kept for years just because they belong to them, and so on. And so it's almost as though at this time, when they've got their new house, they start to have to think about what they've really lost, because during all this period of being in the corduroy zone, you're actually not thinking in those terms. You're thinking about getting through it. And I think that's an important period of time. And I've certainly had people say that when they get through there, they start to wonder what it all means. How's my life changed? And this is what I call the identity crisis. Identity is the sense of who we are, which has to do with what's important in our lives. What were we on about? This man in Queensland had an identity crisis because he no longer really loved the farm that was his centre of his life. He felt he didn't want his family to come out. He felt ashamed of it, you know, and that's a very important thing for him to get over. So the feelings about self, future goals, purpose, life. Now, we will actually process those if we have space. And the space is just be able to reflect, what does this all mean? And that leads on to something that I think is absolutely central to taking care of yourselves in recovery. And that is, I mentioned how talking with this farmer helped him find the problem. I didn't really do anything except listen to him and ask a few questions. He found it himself. He put it together himself between the conversations. He said, I've realised. And Now, we can do that for each other in a community by listening to each other. Now, Mal has said this is the beginning of a series of social events, and I notice there's a Barefoot Bowls barbecue party coming up. Now, nothing suits everybody, but it's wonderful to have a series of community events that will keep running through the next few years. There's an American researcher called Daniel Aldridge, who's done wonderful research for disasters. He was a professor of political science, and he had a job at the New Orleans University, and he moved down there just before Hurricane Katrina. And he knew nothing about disasters, so when he was told to evacuate, he just locked the door and went with his family to the over the state border and had a weekend with friends. His house flooded to the rafters and completely destroyed all his life's work up to that point. So he made a good move. He decided to research disasters. Now, he's done these huge, big studies. He studied all the major disasters in the US going back to the beginning of the San Francisco earthquake in about 1903. He studied all of the different prefectures up and down the coast of Japan with the Fukushima tsunami, looking at what predicts the speed and completeness of recovery. He's looked at all of the New Orleans suburbs. He came out here and the Americans have all this money they don't know what to do with, so they fund all these big research projects. He had a research project in which his team interviewed 3,000 people in New Orleans from all over the city. And he starts this presentation with a big slide showing a map of New Orleans with all of these interviews where these people lived mapped on there, and colour-coded according to how profoundly they felt this event influenced their life, from, let's say, bright red to terrible through to pale blue, not much. And the map is shaded according to the depth of water, right? Can you picture that? And he puts that up and he says to the audience, what's the relationship between the depth of water and the severity of impact of the disaster? And there's silence and everyone looks and looks and looks, and eventually someone says, I can't see any relationship. He said, that's right, there's no relationship. We've done all the mathematics. There's no mathematical relationship between the depth of water. And I think there's a very important thing coming back to this question of who is entitled to assistance. If you sit down and go into the details of people's lives, you can realise that some people are profoundly influenced, even though they didn't have apparently very severe physical impacts. And no one can judge that except them, can they? Because no one actually knows. I was in one flooded community, not around here, but back in 2011, giving a talk. And I noticed halfway back there was a lady sitting there who had a really sad look on her face. And she, at a certain point she said, excuse me, is it right that some people who weren't flooded could be badly affected? And I said, yes, absolutely. And I talked a bit about that. And then I said to her, what impact did you have? And she said, oh, we weren't really affected. We were just our shed was flooded. And there was another woman sitting behind her who, when she said that, rolled her eyes as if to say, oh, you poor lady, your shed was flooded. Well, you should see what, and you can understand how people would feel that way. But I was looking at her and how sad she looked, and I just said to her, what did you keep in your shed? And she said, all the effects from my mother's estate. She died a month before the flood, and I thought of my shed where I've got stuff from my father's beautiful furniture that he made that I can't fit in. I can't bear to get rid of it. You know, it's history and identity, isn't it? It's history and identity that she's lost, and you know that's what she's lost, and it's her problem, and that needs to be respected. And the community will hold together if we can have this understanding that our stress means that we become egocentric. My problem is the worst problem in the world, unless I say, well, Mal's lost 1,000 sheep and I only lost 10, but they were my friends, my 10 sheep. You know, we'll do that sort of thing. But if you didn't lose sheep, I'm not interested in you. You should see I've lost sheep, don't you realise, and so on. We get this sort of very simplistic sort of attempt to compare. In fact, the American researchers discovered this as when they first started to look at disasters in the 1960s, and they got a name for it. They call it relative deprivation. I compare my losses to other people's losses, and that tells me whether I should be upset or not. So if I haven't lost as much as other people, I don't feel I should be worried. And so I override what it really means to me. And if somebody else has lost what I think is less than me, I say, well, what are you complaining about? Now that creates divisions and tensions. Everybody's lost what they've lost, and everybody's got the consequences they've got. And if we can respect that and then be interested, people will talk to each other. And when they talk to each other, you really get to understand. You can, my goodness, I hadn't thought about that. I can understand how that would be hard. I've got my problem, you got your problem. They're not the same, but we share the fact that we're all struggling. And that's the commonality. And if we can keep coming back to that commonality, you know, when we've got something in common with someone, we feel supported, don't we? That magical ingredients of support that makes us feel more capable, makes us feel more able to engage, to make those phone calls, to make the decisions, to fill out the forms. That sense of being part of a community. Now, what Daniel Aldridge found with all his big studies was the one factor that best predicts the speed and completeness of recovery is not the amount of money that's spent, not the amount of infrastructure, not the political influence, but what he calls social capital. You know, financial capital is money you've got in a bank that's doing nothing, so you can just draw on it. It's available. Social capital is relationships, friends, communication systems, people you can call on, people who've got information, people who know people who know people who can do things for you. There's a whole range of different ways they look at that concept of social capital. And that's what arises in communities as a result of talking and sharing your experiences. You will get an ability to think about things when you talk about it with others, because you will, if someone's interested, you have to put it into words. When we put things into words, we can think about them. When we can't find the words, it's just big bundles of feeling. And so over the years, I've noticed how powerful it is for communities to have regular opportunities to catch up. You don't have to go to everyone, you just go every now and again. And you'll find information. You will find that other people will have solved problems that you haven't, and you will have solved problems that they haven't, and you'll be able to have a sort of collective problem-solving thinking, sharing all the knowledge. You don't have to invent everything. If you're not sleeping, somebody else has done something that helps them sleep, you can try it out, and so on. And so I would really encourage, as a community, you think about how can we get networks together where you can meet, have activities, because the bowls, there'll probably be a bit of humour in the barefoot, won't there? There'll be a few jokes, there'll be a bit of laughter, there'll be a bit of pleasure and leisure. And people will go away feeling great. I can remember Charlton telling me about they got together as a community after the flood and renovated the hall and had a huge ball there that they, had a wonderful time, and what a landmark that was. And so this building up of networks that will actually give everyone the feeling it's not just me, I'm part of something bigger. That's the quality of support. Support empowers us. The feeling supported, and it's the feeling of aloneness. I want to make a brief comment about suicide before I finish. The research shows that you don't get greatly increased numbers of suicides after disasters, but there are always people who are struggling, and when you get the really difficult, painful period of the stress of disaster recovery, combined with the sense in that stress of being isolated and not being able to see how you're going to get through it, that can make the risk of suicide more intense for people. And working with people who have these difficulties, what you can see is that as the stress gets more intense, people withdraw into themselves. They withdraw their emotions into themselves, which means they don't feel connected. And once we don't feel connected, meaning seems to slip away. What's the point? And therefore, I think that the best thing is just to help people keep engaging. And then it's like if you connect, you get a bit of an exchange of emotion and information, and that exchange makes you feel part of something bigger. I think it's one of the most important protective factors. And so that means if you're aware that people are isolated or have withdrawn, or it's not to say they necessarily have suicidal thoughts, but it's just they may need to be invited. You know, we're going along to the Barefoot Bowl, so do you want to come? Might be just enough to jog them along. This fact that they are valued. Because it's true, isn't it? It's when suicides occur, we realise how important everybody is. Everybody is important. And somehow the risk in disasters is this sort of more egocentric, my problem's worse than yours, or how come you're getting that money, etc. I can tell you that there was a lot of problems in Ash Wednesday because to register for a grant, you had to provide your birth certificate, your title deeds for your house, your marriage certificate, and they'd all gone up in flames. And so you had all these... So there was... I remember the discussions. There was a sort of a moment in the late 80s when there was a whole change, and the government made it much easier to make it. Now, what that meant was some people probably got things they didn't deserve. But I remember reading the paper in, it would be about 7 or 8 years after Black Saturday, and they reported a conviction of somebody who was, I forget whether they were fined or imprisoned because they had rorted the system in Black Saturday and were not entitled and they'd taken fraudulent. So you see, the system will catch up with them. So everyone thinks they know what people have or what they haven't, but they don't know. They only know the gossipy stuff. And so I think to suspend judgment and to say our greatest resource is each other, let's kind of create these opportunities for us to come together and really look after the quality of life, which means give ourselves attention and leisure and create some enjoyment, and then and use the services. Use them early, the financial counsellors, the mental health, the physical health. Go to the GP regularly and have checkups. So he asks or she asks you, are you sleeping? What are you eating? We don't eat well in stress, do we? We've had a good dinner tonight though. This way we actually engage before we hit the wall. In Black Saturday, there was a group of people that came forward for help towards the end of the 3rd year. And then another group towards the end of the 4th year who'd had no contact with the system before that. And they were people who were probably normally pretty resilient. They said, we thought we could do this ourselves. I've always solved my problems myself. But now I've hit the wall, I'm too depressed to get out of bed, I just can't cope. Now, wouldn't it have been better if they had participated in activities 2 years earlier? Then they wouldn't have had that demoralising experience of becoming incapable of managing their life. They would have had an experience of strength. And that leads us into, we don't have time to talk about, the whole idea of post-traumatic growth and the unique things that people learn when they go through something like this and come out the other side feeling, I feel proud of what I've been able to achieve. And we can do that much more together. Look, I'll just stop there. Yeah.
If there's anything really pressing. A lot of thought in what Rob has said, and I'm sure you'll take away and digest it. But if you have a pressing question, please, yes?
Well, it's more a comment. We're from Charlton, and most of us were here in 2011.
Yep. Did you go to the ball?
I did.
Yeah.
Yes. We did a lot. I joined the Red Cross.
Good.
One of the things I found that absolutely blew my mind was the anger against other members of the community whose insurance company, they'd been paid out but they hadn't been.
Yeah.
And I remember I was saying to my colleagues before, we had a CWA meeting one night and somebody said something that offended somebody else, and there was a stand-up, drop-down, screaming match between all these women that had been friends for generations.
Yeah.
And it split the CWA in two, half left. And it was just this pure reaction this many months down the track, and some of that has not been healed. Even 11 years later, there are people that say, I remember, and I'll never forgive her.
Yeah. This is like everyone's in an emotional state of exhaustion. Now, when you get a strong surge of anxiety, one way of dealing with anxiety is fear of what might happen in the future. Like the fear of the snake is, I'm going to do something before I even know it because it's there. That's fear. Anxiety is there another snake? Now, I can't deal with that because it's not happened yet. That's why anxiety is such a disturbing experience, because we have this strong fear of possibilities that we can't do anything about. So we've got to actually recognise I'm anxious about something I'm imagining and deal with it that way. But one way we can get away from the powerlessness of anxiety is to get angry, blame somebody. And this is a universal human tendency. When we're frustrated, etc., we actually target somebody else. And people who, let's say, are not insured and who feel despairing and anxious, they've got a huge bundle of emotion there, and they find out somebody is insured and they say the wrong thing, and suddenly it all converts to anger. And this is a very destructive process at the time when we most want togetherness. And I think the first thing we need to do is understand these. It's totally predictable. I get many stories from many different communities where these divisions open up. And I think it's very important that we recognise the risk and try to actually manage them and get people to step back and realise, look, we're all at the end of our tether. We've got to give each other a break and so on. And that also means people being respectful and thoughtful. One good way to do that is to keep good manners. When we get stressed, manners go out the window, don't they? We start to be short and brusque and use too many four-letter words, and go straight to the nit instead of talking nicely. Yeah.
One more. We want to get you home at a reasonable time, so I'll make this the last one. And then you have a copy.
But I think we've had a bigger disaster with COVID.
Yeah.
And I can't get over the number of angry people. Everyone's angry, and what you're saying is making perfect sense.
Yeah.
It's anxiety about what's going to happen.
It's
also, people have got no energy to do anything.
Yeah.
They're stuck in the result,
yeah.
so to speak.
I think, see, coping with all the changes of COVID is like a stress situation because we're having to reinvent our lives. Now, once you're in stress, it's like you're under a state of pressure. And the analogy I use is that it's like a diver working at depth. There's a lot of pressure and we can make that adjustment, go down deep and do things. The problem comes when we come up, doesn't it? We get the bends. Now, I call that a decompression reaction, and what I've noticed for many years is that when people have a protracted period of stress and they come out of it, they usually feel really awful. Instead of just saying, oh, thank God that's over, they have this decompression reaction. And I think we're still in decompression from COVID. And that's when the cellular fatigue has to be rebuilt. It's a different sort than recovering from too much work after a disaster. But the cellular fatigue means I've got no fund of energy to just tolerate, to overlook, to give a bit of space to somebody who said something silly. But if we talk about it, we can actually, have a bit of understanding, and that gives us a little bit of space. So yes, we've got to factor that in too, COVID.
Leave it there, Rob. Thank you very much. Will you put your hands together, please?